Today's video is on oxidative phosphorylation. So, oxidative phosphorylation is the fourth and final stage in aerobic respiration. So I recommend, if you haven't looked at the previous 3 stages, that you go watch my videos. And this is on glycolysis, the link reaction, and Krebs cycle. So what is oxidative phosphorylation? Well, phosphorylation, we know, is the addition of a phosphate group. And oxidative means relating to a process where something is oxidized. And to be oxidized means the loss of electrons, hydrogen, or oxygen. And it can be either one of these 3 depending on what reaction it's taking place in. And so our oxidative phosphorylation takes place on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So we know that our mitochondria has an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And this inner membrane is formed of cristae, and these cristae are folds in the membrane, and these are to increase the surface area. And we want to increase the surface area because this membrane holds the enzymes and other proteins involved in oxidative phosphorylation. So if we increase the surface area of the membrane, that means we increase the amount of enzymes and proteins available for respiration for this oxidative phosphorylation, allowing us to increase the rate of oxidative phosphorylation. So what is the first step in oxidative phosphorylation? And this is electron transport. So we have reduced FAD and reduced NAD, and this is produced from the previous stages of respiration. So this is produced in glycolysis, the link reaction, and Krebs cycle. Most importantly, Krebs cycle. This produces the largest amount of reduced FAD and reduced NAD. So our reduced FAD and reduced NAD come to our membrane. So they start off in the matrix because they were made in the matrix, and they come up to the inner membrane before the intermembranal space. And so they are reduced, so our reduced FAD and reduced NAD are called reduced because they have gained electrons in these previous stages. So these molecules come up to the membrane and they donate an electron from their hydrogen that they have gained. So they gained a hydrogen, and now an electron is being lost from this hydrogen. And this electron is given to the first molecule in the electron transport chain. So this is passed on to a molecule, a protein usually, in the inner membrane. So now we have produced a H+ ion because our hydrogen has lost an electron, it's become positive, and we have an NAD. So we have taken our reduced NAD, we've oxidized it because it's lost the hydrogen now, and so now we're left with NAD again. So our reduced NAD comes to the membrane, it donates an electron, forming hydrogen and NAD. And this is the same for reduced FAD. So the next part in the process is proton transport. So we've added these electrons into our electron transport chain by our reduced FAD and our reduced NAD. And these electrons travel down this electron transport chain. And this is done by a series of oxidation reduction reactions. So this means when an electron is passed on to the next molecule, this molecule is reduced because it has gained an electron. But as soon as this electron is passed on, the molecule is oxidized again because it loses an electron. So it's a series of oxidation reduction reactions along this electron transport chain. And as these electrons move down this chain, they lose energy, so they're releasing energy constantly. And this energy that these electrons release is used to actively transport H+ ions from our matrix. So we have produced H+ ions by oxidizing our reduced FAD and NAD, but there are also H+ ions in the matrix. So we're actively transporting H+ ions into the intermembrane space. against their concentration gradient. So as it's against their concentration gradient, we need energy to pump them in via active transport. And it's this energy released by these electrons moving down this chain that allows us to provide the energy to actively transport these hydrogen ions into the intermembranal space. So the next stage is ATP formation. So because we've actively transported all of these H+ ions into this space, we now have a high accumulation or concentration of H+ ions in this intermembrane space. So now they have a high concentration, a higher concentration than in the matrix. These H+ ions can now diffuse back down their concentration gradient into the matrix via ATP synthase. So they travel through this ATP synthase enzyme. And ATP synthase converts the potential energy of a H+ gradient, because we know that concentration gradients have potential energy. So this ATP synthase can convert this potential energy of our H+ gradient into chemical energy, and this chemical energy is used in synthesizing ATP. So as our H+ ions move through the ATP synthase, they cause a structural change in the enzyme, forcing ATP synthase to catalyze the formation of ATP. And this is from ADP and phosphate. So our ADP is being phosphorylated, it's gaining a phosphate group to become ATP. And the final stage is water formation. So at the end of the electron transport chain, so we've moved our electrons down this chain, they've released their energy, allowing the active transport of H+ ions that have now diffused back down their concentration gradient, allowing for the formation of ATP. But as these electrons have now reached the end of the electron transport chain, they need to be removed. And if they're not removed, this means that the process cannot continue, because the series of oxidation reduction reactions will stop, because the last molecule will not be oxidized again, so it cannot gain another electron. So the chain will stop, so the process will not continue. So we need to remove the electrons from the electron transport chain. So this is done by passing the electrons on to oxygen molecules. So these oxygen molecules are the final acceptors in the electron transport chain. So the electrons in the electron transport chain are added to an oxygen molecule. And this reduces the oxygen because it has gained electrons, and this reduced oxygen combines with H+ ions that have been travelled back down into the matrix. So they've diffused back into the matrix, and these H+ ions can now combine with our now reduced oxygen to form water. So what are our overall inputs and outputs? So we know we started off with 10 reduced NAD and 2 reduced FAD, and these were created from the previous stages of respiration. And because we oxidize both of these, we lose hydrogen. We form 10 NAD and 2 FAD. We have 6 oxygen molecules as our final acceptors of electrons, meaning we can form 6 water molecules by combining these reduced oxygens with H+ ions. And we also have approximately 36 ADP molecules that we input to be phosphorylated to form approximately 36 ATP molecules. So now let's look at the overall equation for aerobic respiration. So we have glucose plus 6 oxygen plus around 40 ADP equates to 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters plus 40 ATP. So let's think about where we get all of these from. So our glucose, our one glucose molecule, was our first reactant from glycolysis. So if you remember back to glycolysis, the first stage of respiration, of aerobic respiration, our first input was one molecule of glucose. And then our oxygen is our final acceptor of electrons in the electron transport chain in oxidative phosphorylation, which we've just looked at, because these oxygens are required to accept electrons so that the chain can continue. And then we have ADP to form our ATP. So notice with glucose and oxygen, they are not regenerated in the other stages of respiration. So we don't get out this an output of these as well. So they are overall reactants because we don't gain them back at the end. And then we have our carbon dioxide product, and this is because this is a byproduct in Krebs cycle and the link reaction. And then we have water, and this is the oxidative phosphorylation product because we have combined our H+ ions with our reduced oxygen molecules. And we also have ATP formed from the phosphorylation of ADP by our ATP synthase when our hydrogen ions are diffusing passively through into the matrix. So we can see where all of our reactants and products have come from. Our reactants are used and not regenerated, and our products are produced but not used. So they're overall inputs and overall outputs.